Hello, and welcome to Ruby Reads Bedtime Stories. Today we have another tale from the Emerald Isle of Ireland. Tonight's story is called The Haughty Princess. There once was a very worthy king, whose daughter was the greatest beauty that could be seen far or near, but she was as proud as Lucifer, and no king or prince would agree to marry her. Her father was tired out at last, and invited every king and prince, and duke, and earl that he knew or didn't know, to come to his court to give her one trial more. They all came, and the next day after breakfast they stood in a row in the lawn, and the princess walked along in front of them to make her choice. One was fat, and says she, "I won't have you, beer barrel." One was tall and thin, and to him she said, "I won't have you, ramrod." To a white-faced man she said, "I won't have you, pale death." And to a red-cheeked man she said, "I won't have you, coxcomb." She stopped a little before the last of all, for he was a fine man in face and form. She wanted to find some defect in him, but he had nothing remarkable but a ring of brown curling hair under his chin. She admired him a little, then carried it off with, "I won't have you, whiskers." So all went away, and the king was so vexed. He said to her, "Now to punish your impudence, I'll give you to the first beggar man or singing fool that calls." And sure as the hearth money, a fellow all over rags, and hair that came to his shoulders, and a bushy red beard all over his face, came next morning and began to sing before the parlour window. When the song was over, the hall door was opened, and the singer was asked in. The priest brought, and the princess was married to Beardy. She roared and bawled, but her father didn't mind her. "There," he says to the bridegroom, "is 5 guineas for you. Take your wife out of my sight, and never lay me eyes on you or her again." Off he led her. And dismal enough as she was, the only thing that gave her relief was the tone of her husband's voice and genteel manners. "Whose wood is this?" says she, as they were going through one. "It belongs to the king you called Whisker's yesterday." He gave her the same answer about the meadows and the cornfields, and at last a fine city. "Ah, what a fool I was," she says to herself. "He was a fine man, and I might have him for a husband." At last they came up to a poor cabin. "Why are you bringing me here?" says the poor lady. "This was my house," says he, "and now it is yours." She began to cry, but she was tired and hungry, and went in with him. Oh dear, there was neither a table laid out nor a fire burning, and she was obligated to help her husband to light it, and boil their dinner, and clean up the place after, and the next day he made her put on a stuff gown and a cotton handkerchief. When she had her house readied up, and no business to keep her employed, he brought home some willows, peeled them, and showed her how to make baskets. But the hard twigs bruised her delicate fingers, and she began to cry. Well, then he asked her to mend their clothes, but the needle drew blood from her fingers, and she cried again. He couldn't bear to see her tears, so he brought a creel of earthenware, and sent her to market to sell them. This was the hardest trial of all, but she looked so handsome and sorrowful, and had such a nice air about her, that all her pans and jugs and plates and dishes were gone before noon, and the only mark of her old pride she showed was a slap she gave to a buckeen across the face when he axed her to go in and take a share of a quart. Well, her husband was so glad, he sent her with another creel the next day, but faith! Her luck was deserting her. A drunken huntsman came riding, and his beast got in among her ware, and made a disaster of every mother's son of 'em. She went home crying, and her husband wasn't at all pleased. "I see," says he, "you're not fit for business. Come along, I'll get you a kitchen maid's place in the palace. I know the cook." So the poor thing was obligated to stifle her pride once more. She kept very busy, and the footman and the butler would be very impudent and about looking for a kiss. But she let out a screech of her very first attempt that was made, and the cook gave the fellow such a lambasting with the besom that he made no such second offer. She went home to her husband every night, and she carried the broken victuals wrapped in papers in her side pockets. A week after she got service there was a great bustle in the kitchen. The king was going to be married, but no one knew who the bride was meant to be. Well, in the evening the cook filled the princess's pockets with cold meat and puddings, and says she, "Before you go, let us have a look at the great doings in the big parlour." So they came near the door to get a peep, and who should come out but the king himself, as handsome as you please, and no other than King Whiskers himself. "Your handsome helper must pay for her peeping," he said to the cook, "and dance a jig with me." Whether she would or no, he held her hand and brought her into the parlour. The fiddlers struck up, and away went him and her. But they hadn't danced 2 steps when the meat and puddings fell out of her pockets. Everyone roared out, and she flew to the door, crying piteously. But she was soon caught by the king and taken into the back parlour. "Don't you know me, my darling?" says he. "I'm both King Whiskers, your husband, and the ballad singer, and the drunken huntsman. Your father knew me well enough when he gave you to me, and all was to drive your pride out of you." Well, she didn't know how she was with fright and shame and joy. Love was the uppermost anyhow, for she laid her head on her husband's breast and cried like a child. The maids of honor soon had her away and dressed her as fine as hands and pins could do it, and there was her mother and father too, and while the company were wondering at what end the handsome girl and the king, he and his queen, and who they were, didn't know her in her fine clothes, and the other king and queen came in, and such rejoicings and fine doings as there was, none of us will ever see in any way. Thank you for spending time with me, and may you sleep well.